that deer could have ever wound up like that. I actually took a picture, and then it sort of scared me to death. I just went home and I didn't look at it again.
Well, I had one guest, that would scare me too, because, I even had a guest on my show. It said they were out in the woods and they actually saw all of a sudden like a big moose just go up in the air, and it vanished. And that right there would really scare me. Yeah.
And I remember once when I was a real young kid, my uncle used to tell his story about this man that was out doing hay, and for some reason he just floated up in the air and nobody saw him again. But it was when I was real young, and I never asked him about it again.
Well, I had a trucker on my show several months ago, and he's going to be coming back. But he was out going into or coming out of a desert. I think Texas was the state. And, he just looked out his cab window, driver's side cab window, and he noticed this cow going up in the sky. And it didn't have no chains, it didn't have no ropes, and there was no helicopter. And, there was no tornado or nothing going on, and it was enough where it really shook him up.
Boy, it sure would shake me up if I saw anything like that.
Well, yeah, me too. I don't know. Have you ever had an encounter with a UFO by any chance?
Yeah.
Would you care to talk about it?
Well, my sister and I have had several. We started out kind of young. The first encounter was, we didn't know it was a UFO until many, many years later. But we were kids. She was about 4 and I was about 6. And we live on a farm, and just an isolated farmhouse with neighbors a long ways away, and not a gravel road for the road and everything. It was pretty primitive. And we slept in an attic room with walls that went up it slanted up to the ceiling and about 3 feet between them. And it was a clear night, and I woke up, and there was this thing flying around the room inside the house.
Like a drone type of thing?
It looked like a piece of real hot metal. And I was young, and so was she, but we weren't talking about when it happened. But it was dark in the room, and it seemed to know where everything was. I mean, if it'd go up toward a wall, it would turn before it got to the wall, and it would avoid furniture and stuff, like it knew where it was going. And that seemed, I mean, when you're a kid, you don't know that much, but it seemed real unnatural, and it flew around the room. And it flew around for a while, and it got close to us. It was just like a browsing flight. It would move back and forth and up and down and just floated around the room. And several times it got close to us, and it'd always turn. It wouldn't bump into anything. And I was just watching it thinking, it was like it was alive or something. But it wasn't a lightning bug or anything like that. It didn't blink. And then it flew up to the ceiling from one end of the room, but it didn't hit the ceiling. It made a right-hand turn and flew along the ceiling, and there was a chandelier in the middle of the ceiling that was turned off. And without feeling anything or knowing where the walls were or anything, it just began to circle just perfectly right in between the chandelier and the wall, and then in the walls. And then it just made a perfect spiral down. And at that time, I became terrified, and so did my sister, even though we weren't talking to each other or anything. We both started shrieking and ran from the room and fell down the stairs because we bumped into each other. We were in such a hurry to try to get out of there, and ran to our parents, and they didn't believe us. But nobody would believe me except either one of us, except we both had another witness, and we weren't talking to each other when it happened, so we knew that we both saw it, and it was just like we didn't know what it was, but a lot of our family has always remembered it. And then many years later, I read works by Jenny Randalls, the UK ufologist, and she talked about bedroom visitations of young children, and she said that often young children will have experiences with small UFOs, and then later they grow up and they have more experiences with larger UFOs, or more like real UFOs. And I think we kind of fit into that category, although I don't understand anything about it. But she wrote a whole book about it.
Oh, that would be... How old were you roughly, Irene?
I was about 6, and she was about 4.
Oh, boy, that would be hard for somebody that age. But, you know, we have drones now. You know, the military has drones as small as a fly, and which is so interesting. That's how small they got them down. And you just think of an alien technology, you know, keep an eye on people. Maybe they were the people they're looking to abduct, or maybe you guys were even abducted and don't even realize it. But I mean, it seems to kind of fit place. It makes just as much sense to me as somebody saying a gray walked through their bedroom window and came and abducted them and took them aboard a spaceship. I mean, you know, yeah, it makes sense to me.
Well, we did have other experiences, so we fit into the pattern pretty well. And what was sort of unusual is that usually that just happens to one person, but it happened to both of us. And then we had later sightings together, too, when we grew up.
Well, what type of sight? Okay, let's get into this. What type of sightings did you have when you got older? What happened in your life that was strange with UFOs or aliens or something that you can't identify what they were?
Well, we both had other sightings, and we were from the Midwest, where you don't talk about weird things. And so we never talked about it for years. But we wound up on the East Coast, both of us, for a while. I was working for the DIA, and she was taking postgraduate work at Drew University. And we decided to go up and see the New England states, and since we were both on the East Coast. And so I drove up and picked her up. I drove up from Washington, D.C. and picked her up in New Jersey. And we went on to Boston. And we got there, it was still daylight. And so we decided to travel some more. And so we went up and drove into New Hampshire and drove up through New Hampshire for a while until it was going to get dark. And so we decided to go back to Boston. And it turned out, we didn't know it then, but we had actually been on the road where the Hill abduction took place, Betting Barney Hill.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah, but we didn't know it then. But we came back to Boston and drove into Boston, and we were planning to just stay in the middle of Boston and sightsee and everything. But all the motels were busy and closed. I mean, full. And so we were driving out of Boston, and we saw this object south of us as we were leaving Boston. And there was a airport south of us, too. And we could see the airplanes coming in, turning on their landing lights, and, you know, with all their lights and landing at the airport. But this thing we were watching was a whole lot different from the airplanes, and it sort of seemed to be following a road. And my sister kept saying, "This is odd. What is this?" And I kept saying, "Oh, it's a helicopter. It's blinking its landing lights," which made no sense at all because I'd never heard of a helicopter doing that, but I was a scientist, so I explained it to her. And we both admitted then to each other that we'd seen UFOs, and something we'd never talked about. And so, anyway, I got on the outer belt, and I was going on Route 95 out of Boston, which is goes along the coast. And we were driving through woods on both sides. and there was this object. It was about maybe 50 feet from the car as we drove by. It looked like a basketball, except you could see through it. And it had a light on the inside. It was going through a spectrum of colors like blue and red in different shades. And then the inside of the car lit up in green. And I couldn't imagine what was going on. And I looked around for something green, a beam or something that shined in the car, and I couldn't see anything. And the light on the side of the car wasn't green, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then the light in the car turned off or whatever. There was no more green light in the car. And we drove on, and we were arguing about the thing we were watching. And then she started screaming at me to stop because she said it was going to go over the road. And so, I had my hand out the window and I was going to point to her and say, "See, it's a helicopter," and, tell her, because I couldn't imagine it was anything else, because I'd think, if we were watching it, and if it were a UFO, I'd think, the TVs and everything would be down there, police and everything would be looking at it. So anyway, I stopped and looked out the window, and I saw this real distant meteor. And then right over the trees, this thing came over the trees. And I decided my sister was right and I was wrong. That wasn't a helicopter. It was, it had 7 square windows. It was very low. And it was just slowly going over the freeway.
Oh, wow.
And so anyway, she was right. And I had a high-speed film in my trunk and a old Polaroid that they used back then in my car. And so I got the camera out and started trying to load the film into the Polaroid in the dark. And at that time, it was kind of close to us, and you could look up and you could see these windows and the object.
How big was the object roughly? Was it huge or small?
It was dark and you couldn't really see. I had the feeling it was maybe like 2 car lengths or something, but I wasn't sure.
Okay.
But it had 7 windows right in a row, and they were all square. And we grew up on a farm with a freeway through it, and it was a blimp route. And so we were really used to seeing blimps, and we wouldn't have thought this was a blimp or anything because we knew what they looked like. And this was silent. It didn't make a sound, and we could hear the airplanes. And so anyway, I had my camera loaded, and you could see in the window what looked like windows, and there wasn't anything there. And we kept asking each other, "Do you see this?" And it was blinking the lights in a certain pattern, and we were talking about the pattern and asking each other, "Do you see anything inside? Do you hear a noise or anything?" Because we couldn't believe it, and we just kept asking. And so I was ready to take a picture, and I was real thrilled about it because I was thinking, well, I'll be the only person in the world that takes a picture of the inside of a UFO. And a truck driver drove over and parked in front of us, and I thought we had another witness, and he came over and stood beside me and said, "What are you doing, or what are you looking at?" And we didn't say UFOs or anything like that to a strange man, but we pointed, and then he turned around just the opposite direction. He just rotated around, looked in the opposite direction, and said, "I don't see anything." And then rotated around to where he was again and asked the same question again. "What are you doing, or what are you looking at?" And we pointed again, and he rotated around, looked in the opposite direction, and just as opposite as you could look, and said, "I don't see anything." Then he turned around to me again, and then he pointed to his head like I was crazy, and he went back to his truck. Well, at that time, I had missed my good picture because by the time he finished, the thing was farther away, and I had high-speed film, and so I was afraid to take the picture on the freeway in case I got lens flare,